Good day, supporters and listeners of Martin Barna podcast. Today's guest is Mr. Danny Lennon. How are you, Danny?
I am very well, Martin. Thank you so much for asking me on the podcast.
Mr. Lennon is a founder of Sigma Nutrition. He is the host of the long-running popular podcast Sigma Nutrition Radio. I listened to for about 10 years, and I really love the content. I recommend anyone listen to this. He has spoken at conferences and events all over Europe, as well as the United States and Australia. Danny is currently a member of the advisory board of the Sports Nutrition Association, the global regulatory body responsible for the standardization of best practice in the sport nutrition profession. Danny has master's degree in Nutritional Sciences from University College Cork, Ireland. Previous to this, Danny also completed his undergrad degree in biology and physics. Is that all, Mr. Lennon, or is there something I missed?
No, I think that's a pretty good overview of what I've done. So yeah, I think that's enough for the moment.
I know that you have a coaching and also you have a Sigma Nutrition podcast. Are there some very interesting stories from a recording of the podcast or your coaching experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky enough to have a lot of really interesting conversations with a lot of a diverse group of people. And so over time, that has helped shape how I think about nutrition and health and science more generally. And so I think it's difficult to kind of pick out one or two, because in some way, all of those conversations change how I think or things that I end up looking into. In the same way, I've been very lucky with some of the clients I've had to work with over the years. Over the most recent years, I no longer do one-on-one coaching myself. We have a team of coaches that work with people, but all of my work is related to content production on the podcast or lectures and seminars. But previous to that, I was a nutrition practitioner and worked with a variety of people. I was lucky enough to work with a lot of really good athletes, for example, that competed in mixed martial arts or in boxing and other weight class-based sports. And so there's some definitely interesting stories about trying to get them to make weight for fights and some of the interesting things that goes into that. But it's very difficult to pick one or two things.
Yeah, okay. I think this was enough. Is there some contact where people can write you if they want to be coached by your team?
Sure. The best thing to do is just go to sigmanutrition.com. So that's SIGMA nutrition.com. They can find all the details about our coaching service there. If that sounds like something they're interested in, then they can set up a call with one of our coaches who will kind of walk them through any questions they have, explain a bit more about what they do. And at that point, we'll see if it's a good fit for each other. So yeah, that's all just at the website they can go to.
Perfect. Okay, let's start with the first question. Organic food, does it have a place in our meals, or is it just overpriced thing with no real benefits according to science?
Sure. Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, because oftentimes if you were to ask people, maybe in the general population, is it better to eat organic fruit and vegetables? Most people would probably say, yeah, of course, right? We always hear organic is better, but we don't really stop to think of, well, what do we mean by it being better? And then ask, well, is it actually better? And so there's two sides to think about this. There's on one side, is it nutritionally better? So are there, let's say, nutrients in organic fruit and vegetables that are not present in non-organic fruit and vegetables? Because if there is, that might be a consideration. And then the second thing would be not about what's in it, but what is not in it. So is there something in non-organic food that is harmful that organic food doesn't have, that would be therefore contribute to our health? Now, this could be a whole discussion in itself. So to kind of get to the kind of most practical, important points, I would say that overall, there doesn't seem to be any real nutritional differences between organic and conventional produce. For virtually any of those foodstuffs, you can get the same nutritional profile from non-organic foods. The problem then also becomes is organic food tends to have a much higher cost, and cost can be a real barrier to people. So if there is a belief that, oh, I need to consume organic fruit and vegetables, and if I don't, then I'm somehow harming my health, and we know that they're more expensive, that can actually stop people from consuming more fruit and vegetables if we were just to encourage them to consume conventional produce. So with that said, generally, if people were to ask me about this question, I would tend to say that you don't need to go for organic fruit and vegetables. There's no real nutritional benefit to doing so. There is a very significant cost element to consider, especially if that's going to be a barrier to someone consuming more fruit and vegetables. And in most cases, yeah, just go with conventional produce. And if you have an overall diet that has plenty of fruits and vegetables in it, you are probably having a healthier dietary pattern than the vast majority of people. And you're certainly not doing yourself some degree of harm. So I think that's the most kind of practical takeaway I tend to give on that question.
Thank you very much. I say the same thing to my clients because many of them is women with children. Sometimes children don't have a father. They don't have, too much money, and I think it is not effective to focus on organic. There are many other really important things about nutrition, as protein intake, fiber intake, and calories, I think.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, agreed.
Mr. Lennon, do you think meat is bad for you? We hear things about cancer, red meat, etc.
So the meat question can actually be quite complex and difficult to answer. There's a few reasons why. First, we have to talk about like what type of meat we are referring to. The second question then would be, what amount of it in the diet are we referring to? So is it a small amount? Is it a large amount? And then also, if we're talking about differences between no meat, small amount, or lots of meat in the diet, we also have to think about, well, what would be replaced in the diet if you have more or less meat? So for example, if you can get more and more of your calories from red meat, that means you have to replace other foods. So we have to factor that consideration in. I think to start with, the things we're most clear on from the evidence would be in relation to processed meat specifically. So this would be things like sausage or salami or bacon. So processed cuts of meats where they've undergone a degree of processing. Other things are added like nitrates and so on. And there seems to be a really clear convergence of evidence to show that in general, that is detrimental to health when consumed in relatively high quantities. And there seems to be a dose response relationship there, meaning that the more of them you consume, then the worse the outcomes. So that people with the highest intakes of processed meat will tend to have worse health outcomes. Probably one of the strongest relationships here is with colorectal cancer. And so that is a really well-established, strong link in those who have the highest intakes of processed meats tend to have higher risk of colorectal cancer compared to those with very little intake or no intake. The other question that becomes more difficult that people mostly debate is, well, what about unprocessed red meat? So a piece of steak, for example, where it's not undergone processing, it's not had it, doesn't have lots of salt or nitrates added to it. It's just an unprocessed piece of red meat that we know has a certain nutrient profile, contains various vitamins and minerals, for example, is a good source of protein and so on. Is this something that in certain quantities can have a detrimental impact on health? This can be more difficult to work out, but in general, I would say it seems that there also does seem to be a certain threshold that when you go past that in terms of intake, there does seem to be pretty strong associations with negative outcomes. So those eating the most unprocessed red meat, for example, compared to those eating a smaller amount, tend to have increased risk here as well. We also then need to think of the type of cut of meat here. So if it's a more fatty cut of meat, so a piece of steak with lots of fat on it, for example, then that animal fat is going to be contributing saturated fat to the diet. And we know that alone, if you have a high amount of saturated fat in the diet, that increases risk of cardiovascular disease. And so therefore, if someone is consuming a lot of fatty meat and therefore has a high saturated fat intake, that will have a negative impact on cardiovascular disease. And by swapping to leaner cuts of meat, as an example, and reducing that saturated fat intake, they can have a reduction in that cardiovascular disease risk. But even at that, it does seem that there's at least potential mechanisms for someone that has the highest intakes of red meat to be to have negative health consequences relative to lesser intakes. Now, it's more difficult to define here, because it seems that if we're talking about, let's say, 100, 150 grams of red meat per day, that amount or less, moving between that doesn't seem to tell us anything, doesn't any change in risk. So if someone consumes 20 grams or 100 grams, we don't really see an increased risk if we're talking about red meat. Once it starts getting above, say, 150 grams per day, then we actually do see that difference in risk between that highest intake and lower intakes. So I think there's certainly cause where we would want to maybe be moderate on overall red meat intake, and certainly not have it contributing a huge amount of our daily intake, and certainly be mindful of the portions we're consuming. And then the other thing is, if that is making up a large amount of our diet relative to other foods, we could be missing out on other healthful foods. Again, the basis of a healthy dietary pattern being lots of and fruit and vegetables. And so if someone is consuming red meat in the diet, I would say do so in a kind of moderate degree of consumption. So again, aiming to keep it under maybe those numbers I mentioned, but also not be consuming it every single day. And then also have an overall dietary pattern that has lots of fruit and vegetables in with it as well. But certainly the evidence is most strong for processed meat. And then there does seem to be associations with red meat as well. And there's mechanistic reasons for why that's the case. So that's generally my thoughts on the meat issue.
Thank you very much. It was really comprehensive. Okay, if one is to choose some kind of diet, we need to lose weight for health reasons, let's say. Is there any best kind of dieting, best way of dieting? I mean, for example, low carb, keto, or fasting, or vegetarian, or whatever. What is the best kind of diet, in your opinion?
Yeah, so before being able to answer that question, we have to think to ourselves, well, what are we trying to achieve with a certain type of diet, and what factors will lead to that result? So what I mean by that, for example, if someone's goal at a certain time is to lose body fat, they therefore need to be in a calorie deficit to do so. So that's one requirement. So regardless of what type of diet they end up picking, whether that's low carb, high carb, vegan, etc., it needs to place them in a calorie deficit. If we're talking about just being healthy, then we know there are certain things and part of the dietary pattern. So by dietary pattern, we mean the typical foods people usually consume on a daily basis on average, right? As opposed to any one day. We know that there are certain things within a dietary pattern that confer good health. So relatively high fiber intake, a pseudo amount of protein, an overall calorie intake that is appropriate, so it's not too high, that someone is consuming too many calories and gaining body fat, that is limiting the amount of saturated fat in the diet that I've mentioned already. So that would be keeping saturated fat intake to less than 10% of their daily calories, limiting the amount of added salt and added sugar in the diet. So no matter what type of strategy they pick, it should still fit all those things, right? And you can do low carb, high carb, keto, vegan, fasting, whatever type of diet you hear about, and stick to those principles. You can also do all those things and not stick to those principles. So those principles are the most important thing. So then the question becomes of, well, is there one of those types of diets that you mentioned that is best for achieving those principles that I've just mentioned? And the way to think about this is there's kind of two answers. There's one on a general level. So is there one best diet for everyone? And then there's is there one best diet for me as an individual? And there might be a different answer here. So for the people in general, for everyone, there is no such thing as the best diet. All different types of dietary strategies could work, but they could also fail. It depends on the individual. But as long as they are able to stick to that diet and stick to those principles I mentioned, that's the most important thing. Now, because of those principles I mentioned, it makes some types of diets probably more healthy than others. So, as an example, if we have said that we want to have a diet that is high in fiber, has lots of fruit and vegetables, limits the amount of saturated fat in the diet, and so on, then we know that going with a carnivore diet is probably not a good idea because it makes it almost impossible to reach any of those things. Similarly, if we think about the typical way that people might start on a ketogenic diet, right? If they've just read about this somewhere on the internet and then start mainly only consuming animal foods, maybe they're not paying attention to how much fiber they're consuming, maybe they're therefore having really high intakes of saturated fat. Therefore, they are not sticking to those principles I outlined. So that would actually be not a diet that's in line with it. Now, if they wanted to go that route, they could still meet all those principles I said and still technically eat a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet, but it just takes a bit of work. So with that said, there's probably certain dietary patterns that are probably not a good idea, certainly like a carnivore diet. And then others that might just be unnecessarily restrictive. In terms of most of the evidence, we see dietary patterns that are something like the Mediterranean diet having lots of really good quality evidence behind, or the DASH diet, a similar type of dietary pattern, but it doesn't have to be those, something similar that still meets those principles. So I think there's no one best diet. It just depends on, does your diet fit those list of principles I mentioned, yes or no? That would dictate whether it's a good diet. Then in terms of an individual, this would be what allows them to stick to those principles the best. Because for one person, they can go on a vegetarian diet, and for them, that's actually quite easy to stick to. And therefore, it's going to make sure they're eating lots of fruit and vegetables, eating enough fiber. It allows them to control their calorie intake. And for that person, they don't feel hungry on it. They feel really good. They feel lots of energy. For someone else, they might find it really difficult, and therefore they're not actually able to stick to it. So it'd be hard to call that the best diet for them. For that person, they actually find when they go on a low carb diet, they don't feel as hungry. They enjoy the food choices a bit better. They find it easier to meet their calorie intake because they actually don't feel as hungry on this type of diet. And so in that case, a low carbohydrate diet might actually be the best for that individual. And so all we would have to make sure is, okay, can we have them eat a low carb diet whilst also making sure they get lots of fibrous vegetables and plenty of fiber in the diet, and choose sources of fat that are relatively low in saturated fat and instead higher in unsaturated fat? Because in that case, they could still meet all those principles that we've discussed whilst eating a low carb diet. So in that sense, I think with all that said, the simple answer is there is no one best diet to follow. Instead, there is a set of principles that are best to follow. And there are principles that are bad to follow. And so knowing which of those principles you want to pick in your diet is the right way to go. And then for any individual, what way you set up your diet in terms of the amount of carbohydrates, if it's low or high, doesn't really matter. Whether you do fasting or not, doesn't really matter. What matters is whatever style you choose, does it allow you to eat an appropriate amount of calories, enough fiber, not too much saturated fat, not too much sugar, not too much salt, and plenty of fruits and vegetables. That would be the way to go.
Perfect answer. Thank you very much. I can see now why you are as good coach as you are.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Lennon, what about supplements? It is a very good topic. Many people ask me, Martin, which supplements are really science-based, I should buy them, and which are not as good? You know, again, money is the issue for many people, and we want to save some money for them. What would you recommend based on science?
Sure. So I think I would first separate supplements into two groups. One, supplements aimed at just general health, and then supplements we could talk about in relation to performance. So if someone's in the gym or competing in a certain sport, there's evidence-based supplements there that can certainly help their performance. But if we first talk about someone who just generally wants to be healthy, is there supplements that they need to take or that they should take? I think I don't think there's really any supplement that everyone should take or needs to take. I think when you look at, for example, the evidence around multivitamins, most of that seems to be pretty useless, that it doesn't really do anything in terms of impacting end health outcomes. And there could be a number of reasons why, whether that's the low dosing in a lot of these products, or it's just not enough, or as we see with a lot of supplement trials, they actually don't have the end impact that we predict they would. And again, it seems to be beneficial to eat an overall healthy diet as opposed to worrying about supplements. So multivitamins tend to have very poor evidence behind them. I don't generally recommend those. Other ones that are quite popular that might be useful in certain situations would be dependent on the person. By that, I mean, there is no supplement I would say everyone needs to take, but there are some supplements I think are useful for people to be aware of based on what their diet looks like and based on what their circumstances look like. For example, if someone follows a vegan diet, then I would absolutely recommend them to consume a vitamin B12 supplement because they're unable to get that from their diet. And so it's just a good idea for them to consume vitamin B12 as a supplement. If someone doesn't consume any sources of fatty fish like salmon or mackerel or other sources of omega-3s, then an omega-3 supplement might be a good idea in that case. Now, there's also a lot of conflicting evidence around omega-3 supplementation, how effective it actually is for impacting health outcomes. But in this situation, if someone doesn't consume any good sources of omega-3, I think it's just a good idea for them to take a supplement just to cover their bases there. So a good omega-3 supplement if someone doesn't consume food sources of it, but probably better off if they can get it from foods. Another one would be potentially any case where someone has an actual nutrient deficiency, and this is where they would probably be recommended by their doctor. So let's say they go to their doctor, they get a blood test, and they are found to have a vitamin D deficiency. Then they're probably going to be told to get a vitamin D supplement, and they might for a period of time have to take that quite a high dose and then maybe drop it down. But that would be a case where supplement would be a good idea because they need to correct this nutrient deficiency. At the same time, if someone has anemia or an iron deficiency, their doctor would tell them to take an iron supplement. Again, that would be a good idea. And so these are all supplements that could be a good idea, but only in those select circumstances. So we have to think about, why would I take a supplement? There always should be a really good reason for telling someone to take a supplement and for choosing to take one. Because again, like you said, it costs money, and it also costs mental energy to think about taking it. And if it's not going to do anything, or potentially even if it's going to do harm, we need to be aware of that. So there should be a really good reason for taking it, like correcting a nutrient deficiency, or like getting something like B12 because you're not able to consume it from your diet, or potentially omega-3, for example. So those would be cases where it might be useful to go the supplement route. But in general, there's very few cases that I would say I tell everyone to take this supplement.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Look, many people are asking questions about supplements. Which supplement is the best, which I need to buy? But I see that almost no one is asking me or other coaches about sleep and importance of sleep or circadian rhythms. Do you think, could we focus on this and tell people why sleep is so important?
Yeah, this is a fantastic point because when you start looking into some of the physiology around sleep and some of the evidence around sleep, it kind of becomes overwhelming of just how many of the systems in the body that it influences. Pretty much all systems of the body will get negatively impacted if you have restricted sleep over a long period of time. So I think first I would tell people, like, from anything we say from this point here, don't get stressed out if you have one night of bad sleep, or if you wake up in the night, it's no big deal, right? Humans are actually pretty robust and strong, and one night of bad sleep is no big deal. It's if you have a habit of every day over a long period of time purposely having very short amounts of sleep, that can have very negative consequences for virtually every system of the body I can think of. And so if someone's goal, so on a practical level, let's say someone's goal is they're starting to diet and they want to make better food choices and they want to reduce their calorie intake. And so they're really focused on all these things. They're asking about supplementation and what diet should I have and the training plan, but then they're sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night. That degree of sleep restriction consistently over a number of days, we actually can see that that changes hunger levels as people self-report hunger in a study. But also we can measure certain hormones, like ghrelin is one hormone. It's an appetite hormone. As that goes higher, appetite increases. And we can see an increase in this hormone from just a few days in a row of restricted sleep. So if you restrict someone's sleep to say 4 hours a night. Now, what that means then is if someone is only sleeping that amount of time for a few days, then despite all their planning around their diet and their training and supplements, they're literally just making it harder for themselves because now they're waking up with higher levels of hunger. Their appetite is greater over the day. You also get changes in another hormone called leptin, which will do the same thing. It actually makes them want to seek out food and to be less active when leptin levels are dropping. So we see this drop in leptin with sleep restriction. And so it's just literally making sticking to their plan more difficult. Then in the long term, we know like that chronic sleep restriction is associated with all sorts of increased risk for various chronic diseases. You could literally just name any of them and you will find a impact of restricted sleep there. So again, there's big long-term risks for chronic disease, but even in the short term, over a few days, what it does to our food choices, what it does to our decision-making, what it does to how irritable we are around people, what it does to athletic performance in the gym or in a sport, all of those get negatively impacted. So I think before doing a lot of other things that people try and focus on, if they can find a way of, is there any way I can improve the quality of my sleep or the amount of time I can sleep or my sleep habits, that would be a really good place to start. Now, for a lot of people, there are some circumstances that they can't change, and that's totally fine. Some people have changing work schedules, or some people have a new small baby at home, and that's going to wake them up and so on. That's totally fine, right? It's the situations where there are things you can control, like staying up for an extra hour on your phone in bed, where if you were to start to think, well, could I get a bit better sleep? Could I not use my phone for that last hour? Could I maybe get to sleep a bit earlier? That can have a dramatic impact, not only because it improves your sleep, but now it has knock-on effects, right? So the sleep improvement, so more sleep in alone would actually improve someone's health. But now we're also having someone wake up with less hunger and a lower appetite. So now it's going to change their food choices over the long term. And that's going to impact their health as well. Now they're going to feel and be able to perform better in the gym or when they're exercising. And that in turn impacts their health. So there's the indirect impacts of improving sleep as well as a direct impact of improving sleep. So yeah, I very much agree that that would be one of the things at the very close to the top of the list that someone should aim to improve if they know there's things that they can change right now, right? So if they're already doing everything they can and there's some external thing, like I said, like a newborn baby or something, that's one situation is like, okay, it's just going to have to deal with it now. Don't worry too much about it. But if you're someone who is purposely choosing to have poor sleep because you are staying up late and playing video games until 3 a.m., then you might want to change that and see what the improved sleep does for your health and your performance and how you feel generally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Lennon, I know you are a very busy man. Do we have time for one more question?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Perfect. Thank you very much. This would be about meal timing or daily meals. Do do we have to consider that our client needs this many of meals or this much of meals? You know, is it the best to eat 1 meal a day, 5 meals a day?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because for a long period of time, there was an idea that there is a certain meal frequency that's better. And typically that used to be around the idea that more frequent meals would be better. So eat small meals, but more often throughout the day. You know, this idea of 6 small meals is going to be better than 3 big meals. And the idea here was that, well, if you do that, each time you eat, you're kind of revving up your metabolism, or you're getting your body into like a fat burning mode. And really, there's no basis to this, either physiologically or certainly when you look at evidence that has compared a lower versus higher meal frequency. There's actually no difference in energy expenditure. So that's how many calories we burn each day. There's no difference in actual changes in body weight. There's no differences in the non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That's energy that we burn through subconscious movements throughout the day. So there's no reason to suspect that one is better than the other. So on a general level, it doesn't matter. Where it does matter is, again, on the individual level. So for one person, they might find a higher meal frequency or a lower meal frequency better. So you might have one client that is like, do you know what, like, I actually don't feel good when I eat like large meals. Can I just split this up into like smaller meals, but I'll eat more frequently? Some people actually like eating more frequently because they find if they have a large gap between meals, they get more hungry. And so those types of clients might be people who you would say, okay, we're going to have smaller meals more regularly. Let's have 6 small-ish meals throughout the day. You might have someone else then who's like, do you know what, I hate having these kind of small meals and snacking. I like having a big serving of food when I'm going to eat, but I don't mind only having 3 meals a day or 2 meals a day even. So for that person, you would have a lower meal frequency, again, based on their preference. Why? Because they're going to stick to their overall diet better if they have something that suits them. And so in that sense, you would have, again, presuming that the overall calorie intake and food intake is the same in those 2 situations, whether they have a high meal frequency or low won't matter. So it's really up to the preference of that individual person, as long as their overall intake is the same. So that would be on the meal frequency. Similar, and I think you kind of mentioned in the question around meal timing is also a consideration here. This is an area where I would say, in general, for most people, I wouldn't worry too much about it, in that first important thing is to get those fundamental things you mentioned earlier right. What's someone's overall dietary pattern? How much calories are you consuming in general? Are you getting healthy food? So lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grains. Are you keeping saturated fat low? Not having too much ultra processed foods, etc. If you're doing all those things, then that is far more important than specific meal timing. So I'd say focus on that first. Don't worry too much about everything else. Then it might come down to a few situations where timing might matter a bit depending on the person. One of the interesting areas that we look at is having very large meals, particularly meals that are high in carbohydrate and fat, late at night, or say close to sleep time, might be more detrimental than having those foods earlier in the day, or having more of those calories earlier in the day. And that's because we just tend to not metabolize carbohydrate and fat as well at night as we do during the day. And so eating large amounts of those at nighttime might mean that we metabolize them more poorly, meaning that, let's say, with carb.
Can you hear me, Mr. Lennon? I just can't hear you now. Can you hear me?
Oh, 1 second.
Now I can hear you again. I'm sorry.
Hear me again? Okay, cool.
Yeah, now it's good. I'm very sorry. Could you say again, let's say last 15 seconds?
Sure. So where should I jump in from? What was the last thing you heard about eating the same
It was
meal at
really
night?
at night, too much fat, too much sugars at night, you cannot metabolize it well. So that was
Yeah,
ending
great.
for the
Yeah.
doctor.
So, given the fact that we don't metabolize those nutrients as well, what would happen then would be an example where if you consume a large amount of carbohydrates during the night versus during the day, your blood sugar response would be worse. So your blood sugar would go higher or stay higher for longer at nighttime than it would during the day. And so that might be a consideration for people who are trying to control their blood glucose, maybe people who maybe have pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, or even people generally who have the ability to maybe have more of that food earlier in the day and it doesn't cause them any undue stress, then it might be something to try out, because there, at least theoretically, that could have a worse outcome if lots of the calories and lots of the carbohydrate and fat is consumed during the nighttime period as opposed to earlier in the day. Now, that might not be necessary for other people who do that and they find that they don't have any adverse outcomes, all their blood tests are good, they feel good, maybe they're probably quite active and so they're probably actually really good at controlling their blood sugar anyway. That might not be as much of an issue for that person. But that's something that we do see in the literature, that late time eating or very close to nighttime, and certainly during the middle of the night, we see worse responses to consuming carbohydrate and dietary fat. The other place where timing of meals becomes a consideration is in two places. One with protein, and then related to that around training. So if someone's goal is to maximize the amount of muscle mass they build or the muscle mass that they retain, let's say if they're dieting, or if we have an athlete who's trying to recover maximally from their training sessions, then it seems like a good idea to have their protein intake at least spread across the day in some manner. So let's say across at least 3 meals is probably better than consuming all your daily protein in one meal at one time. And the idea is that at each of those meals, you can maximize a process called muscle protein synthesis, which, as the name kind of suggests, is building of muscle proteins. And so if you only eat one large protein feeding in the day, then you're kind of missing out on other time points where you can maximize this process. And so having at least kind of 3 high protein meals spread some way across the day would be a good idea for people who are trying to maximize muscle recovery or muscle growth or muscle retention while dieting. Then with athletes, timing is also a consideration of how do I fuel my next activity? That would include things like overall calories and carbohydrate. And then afterwards, how do I recover from that? So that mean getting some protein probably within an hour of finishing training, and then maybe consuming some carbohydrate if they are competing in a sport that uses a lot of carbohydrate and they have a training session within the next, say, 24 hours. Then that might be a situation where they would look at getting some carbohydrate immediately there. So there are lots of considerations around timing in very specific sports nutrition contexts, depending on the sport. But for most people, timing isn't super important for most things, apart from protein. Kind of spreading it maybe across 3 meals is probably a good idea. And then maybe for certain people, just being aware of how much of their calories, carbohydrate, and fat is at the very end of the day, and can we pull some of that to a bit earlier? So those would be a few things related to meal timing, I think.
Thank you very much. If you could give one advice from Danny Lennon based on your coaching experience to people, which would it be?
Oh, wow. I think this is the reason why this becomes a difficult question is everyone needs to hear a different piece of advice, I think. And we all need to hear different pieces of advice at different times in our life. There's this old saying that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And so that suggests that advice is only useful to someone when they're ready to hear it. And so if they haven't got to a point where they actually want to know the answer or where they're ready for it, then it might not be useful. In the same way that there are things that we're that we need to hear at certain points in our life, that if we had heard it earlier, it wouldn't make any sense, or if we heard it later, it wasn't that relevant, but we heard it at the right time. And I think that changes. So that's one way for me maybe to dodge the question, but to try and give an answer. I think if we're talking about nutrition, the first thing I would say to people is to realize that it doesn't need to be in any way perfect. What really matters is what you do on average over a long period of time. It doesn't matter what you do in one specific meal or in one specific day, or maybe even in one specific week. It's on average, what does your diet look like? It doesn't have to be perfect on that day even. It's, does most of the food you consume fit within these kind of characteristics we said? And then also you should have room within that framework to consume foods you just like eating because they're tasty, right? You don't need to, there is no food you actually don't need to, like, that you have to ban from ever eating again. What matters is your overall diet over a long period of time on average. And within that, there is still some room to have any food you want at certain time points, either in small amounts or in larger amounts now and again. And that's no problem. So don't over stress about that. And then the other thing that's kind of related to that is to think about why you are trying to change your diet. If someone is trying to change your diet, and to do it for the right reasons, do it for yourself, do it for intrinsic reasons, but don't do it for what someone else wants, or what you think society wants, or that you need to look a certain way, or any of that nonsense. Do it because you want to be healthy, or you want to perform in a certain sport, or you want to change your health in some manner, as opposed to being pressured to do it for all these other things that society thinks it should tell us how to eat. So those are a few things that come to mind, but I'm sure there's lots of others that I could have said.
Thank you. Is there anything else you would like to say to our listeners today?
I don't think so. I just think I would say thank you everyone for listening into the podcast. I hope it was useful. I hope something here was interesting and informative. And yeah, if it was, they can feel free to message me with any comments or questions. I'm easy enough to find on social media and stuff. So yeah, hopefully it was useful.
Thank you very much for your time. I'm really grateful that you accepted my invitation for my podcast. I'm really excited about this. Thank you very much, Mr. Lennon.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking me. I really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a fine evening.
Yes, same to you, my friend.
Bye-bye.